Hi, this is Dr. Prashant Bharadwaj. Today's discussion will be on waiting lines. Again, in this module, I'll be going through the overview of managing waiting lines, also known as queuing models in many parts of the world. If I ask each one of you to give me a situation where you have waited in line, I'm sure each one of you can give dozens and dozens of examples of where you have waited in lines or in queues. And waiting lines are not only the obvious waiting lines as you see in this picture in an amusement park, but it can also be in manufacturing. It can be scheduling jobs on a particular machine or a factory floor. And as you can see here, the book gives you several situations that you would usually encounter. Supermarkets are the most common examples, but you can see waiting lines or queues in doctor's offices, while waiting for customer service on the phone. You can see that on the highways, toll booths. You can see them in the post office, in banks, on and on and on. But the discussion today is not about you waiting in line. It is about how to design a waiting line system as an operations manager. That is the perspective that we are going to look at. So when you are an operations manager, you have to look at what the customer is looking for in the waiting line. How long is the customer willing to wait before getting upset about the waiting time? When will the customer feel discouraged to even enter the waiting line? How many people in the waiting line is discouraging? And that varies from individual to individual. It can vary from situation to situation. There have been several studies which show that men get more impatient than women, but after a certain amount of waiting time, it doesn't matter whether it is men or women, both get equally upset about the waiting time. Also, if you are waiting for food in a gourmet restaurant, you're willing to wait for 30 minutes, 40 minutes after you place an order. But if you are in a fast food restaurant, you would expect the food in few minutes. If you are waiting for an expert physician, a specialist, obviously you're willing to wait for days, sometimes months, before you can get an appointment. And even during the day of the appointment, sometimes you get to wait for a long period of time. So whether it is a toll booth while entering New York City, or you're waiting in the post office, or in a bank, or in a supermarket, an operations manager has to understand what is the psychology of the person waiting in line. There are also several waiting line superstitions, quote unquote superstitions, for customers. For example, there are many who believe that having multiple checkout counters is better than having a single line from which you are sent to the first open service provider. It has been proven that having a single line leading up to multiple servers is more efficient than having multiple lines leading to their own specific service providers in a supermarket or a bank or a post office. But customers in general like having independent lines because they think they know which line is faster, better for them. It gives them the freedom to pick the line. Many customers feel that if a man is serving at the checkout, it will be faster. I'm not saying that is the truth, but there have been studies which show that people think that way. People think that if a woman is at the checkout, she will be more careful with fragile items. Again, this is one of the superstitions. They also look at the age of the service provider to determine whether they're going to be faster or slower. They look at the gender and then decide whether the service provider will be more careful or less careful. They will look at the people waiting in line, their gender, their demographics, and then come to a conclusion, most of the times wrong conclusions, about how long it will take for their turn at the service. So the point I'm trying to make is customers have their own beliefs about waiting lines. Customers have their own threshold of waiting time. So as an operations manager, you have to be cognizant of these beliefs and many realities. And also you need to find ways of reducing the waiting time and the waiting line. Those are the two key things that you have to consider: how to minimize the waiting time, how to minimize the length of the waiting line, because both perception and reality are affected by the waiting time and the waiting line. You may have the best possible service, but the experience during the waiting time is also important. So if you look at Disney World, for example, when you're waiting in line to go into a ride, there are a variety of attractions there. They entertain you so that the time that you spend goes faster. There are several amusement parks, as you are aware of now, which have fast pass, where you don't have to wait. You can just go in, get a particular time at which you can come back and go through the attraction in limited waiting time. You will see that there are separate counters for faster service. For example, if you go to supermarkets, self-checkout, there are checkout lines for 10 items or less, 15 items or less. You will see in many big cities where in banks they have check deposit only, because depositing a check takes seconds, whereas they can have a separate counter for small business merchants who may be depositing small bills and change every day or every couple of days, and it takes 5 to 10 minutes sometimes to count the hundreds of dollars in small change that they will be depositing. So waiting time is taken into consideration while designing the waiting line. The service time is taken into consideration while designing the waiting line. The easy pass on highways, where you don't have to stop and pay the toll using cash. You have easy pass and you can basically zoom through the toll booth. And we can look at many other examples. Going to an Apple store, you don't have to wait in line. A single person can demonstrate the product, sell the product, and accept the payment right there. You go to many other retail establishments, even before you go into the checkout counter, they can scan all of your products and have a bill for you. So all you have to do is, when you go to the counter, you just pay and leave. There are many instances today where the operations managers have made waiting lines more user friendly. One last example is when you wait on the phone. Most of these customer service centers today tell you it's going to take approximately 5 minutes, approximately 20 minutes before you will be answered. You are fourth in line to be answered. So the customer is aware. Even better today, there are very few companies where they say, if you don't have the time to wait, just leave a callback number and we'll call you back. That's the best customer service you can get. So whenever the service provider is free, they will be able to call you back within the next 30-40 minutes. So today we are going to look at a very basic overview of waiting line models and look at a quantitative approach to designing a waiting line for a very simple scenario. Let us look at characteristics of a waiting line system. When you are looking at a waiting line system, you are looking at where are my customers arriving, how are they arriving. So what is the size of the population? Is it a finite population or an infinite population? A finite population is when I know the exact size of the population. For example, I am sitting in my office during my office hours every week, and I have a finite population of students who can come to my office. They are the group of students who are in my class or who are my advisees. Of course, there can be a small, very small percentage of other students also who may show up, but there is a finite population of students who can show up in my office. On the other hand, if I am a customer service representative of a telephone company sitting in Manila, Philippines, the population size can be infinite. That doesn't mean literally infinite, but it can be unknown. Behavior of the arrivals. So you got to know what is the psychology, the attitude, the behavior of the arrivals. How long are they willing to wait? What discourages them? So on. What is the statistical distribution of the arrivals? Are they going to arrive constantly, one every 5 minutes? Or are they going to arrive at a rate of 20 per hour? So what is the statistical distribution? And in most cases, in waiting lines, the arrival statistical distribution used is Poisson distribution. Poisson distribution, I don't have the time to go back and revisit all of the details of Poisson distribution, but Poisson distribution provides a reasonably good estimate of customer arrivals per time unit or per hour. For example, if I say that the arrivals are Poisson distributed at the rate of 20 per hour, does that mean one arrival every 3 minutes? No, that does not mean one every 3 minutes. So there is a particular frequency, relative frequency for each number of customers per time unit. And whether you use Poisson distribution or a negative exponential distribution, it is the same. For example, if service time or the arrival time is exponential, then the service or the arrival rate will be Poisson distribution. So, for example, if the service facility can process 20 customers per hour, the average service time is 3 minutes. So that does not mean that the arrival is one every 3 minutes. It is, the key word is average. So you may have 5 people coming in the first 10 minutes. In the next few minutes, nobody may show up, and the next 10 minutes you may have 3 people, and so on. But on average, if there are 20 customers per hour, which is the rate, there is an average inter-arrival time of 5 minutes. Similarly, if the service facility can process 30 customers per hour, on average it takes 2 minutes per customer. One customer may take 1 minute, another customer may take 5 minutes, but on average, if the service rate is Poisson distributed with 30 per hour, then the average service time is 2 minutes. Is that clear? So the arrival statistical distribution is Poisson, and the statistical distribution of service time is negative exponential. And like I said, negative exponential provides the time, whereas the Poisson provides the rate. So in essence, it is the same. It is Poisson for both arrivals and service. If you are looking at the arrival rate and the service rate, if you are looking at the time, inter-arrival time of arrivals and the service time, you are looking at negative exponential. You also need to look at the queue discipline or the waiting line itself, whether it is limited or unlimited in length. Again, unlimited, don't take it literally, it means huge. Limited is there is a specific limited space after which you cannot have anybody waiting. We will discuss this in a little more detail in a second. Arrival characteristics, little detail, like I said, you got to know the size of the population is finite or infinite, whether the arrivals are scheduled like in a doctor's office or random, and I already explained to you it is typically the Poisson distribution. What is the behavior of arrivals? There are three terminologies that I want you to be aware of when we talk about behavior. One is balking, that is a customer getting discouraged by the waiting line. If the line is too long, then the customer will say, I don't even want to commit to the waiting line, and they will balk at the entire waiting line. They won't even join the waiting line. Reneging is when you join the waiting line, but after waiting for a little bit, you get discouraged by the waiting time and you give up waiting and leave the waiting line. So just like you renege on a promise, you renege on your commitment to the waiting line. These two are negative behaviors as far as the operations manager is concerned for the waiting line. You don't want any balking or reneging. That is poor customer service, which can result in poor customer goodwill. Also, you do not want people switching lines. That is called as jockeying. Jockeying, as in English, means trying to gain advantage. So just like you see when you are waiting in line in a busy toll booth which has multiple toll booths, people are trying to switch lanes, and you have experienced that in grocery stores also, especially during the holiday season. People trying to switch from one line to another. Why? Because one line is moving slower, either because of the service or because of the customer. You don't want any of these three behaviors to manifest if possible. No balking, no reneging, no jockeying. But you have to first understand what motivates a customer to engage in these behaviors so that you can avoid them if possible in your waiting line system. This is a simple example from the book. This is Dave's Car Wash. It's a service, single server, meaning there is only one car wash here. There are a lot of dirty cars in the population of dirty cars after a snowstorm, and it's a bright sunny day during winter. Many car owners want to get their car washed. They arrive, they wait in a line, and then once the service is completed, they leave. So here you got to know the size of the population, behavior of arrivals. We talked about all of these, statistical distribution of arrivals, Poisson, what are the characteristics of the waiting line, limited versus unlimited, obviously limited until it goes into the highway or the street sometimes. The queue discipline, which means first come first serve in this case, but that is not the only queue discipline. As we discussed earlier, sometimes depending upon the time taken for a particular service, it need not be first come first serve. We will discuss that a little more. But the model that we are going to discuss today, the basic model, the assumption is first come first served. Then the service design, We will discuss that in a second. The statistical distribution of service, that is negative exponential distribution. Some more repetition here. We discussed all of these. FIFO or FCFS, first come first serve or first in first out. Other priority rules may be used, like I said. Single channel, multiple channel system, single phase, multiple phase system. This is an important terminology in waiting lines. The most basic waiting line is a single channel, single phase system. A small bank's ATM is an example of a single channel, single phase. That is, there is only one ATM, single channel. Single phase meaning there are no multiple stages there. You go to the ATM, you finish your service there and leave, whether you are depositing a check or withdrawing money or checking balance. So it's only one phase. You go there to the ATM and be done. In old fashioned barber shop with only one barber is a single channel, single phase. Everybody goes to the barber, waits there, gets the haircut, leaves. The moment there are multiple ATM machines, multiple hairstylists, it becomes a multi-channel, single phase system, assuming that all the service is completed in one stage. Phase can be substituted with the word stage. Single channel, multi-phase. A common example would be a drive-through window of a fast food restaurant. You may have three windows. The first window is to place the order. The second window is to pay the money. The third window is to collect your food. Whether you're ordering just a drink or fries, or you're ordering 4 burgers, 5 nuggets, 6 fries, 7 drinks, on and on. Whatever your order is, you have only one drive-through window, single channel, but you have to go through multi-phase, ordering, paying, receiving food. The most complex waiting line is a multi-channel, multi-phase system. A classic example is when you arrive after an international trip into the United States. First, you go through immigration. That is the first phase, and there will be multiple immigration officers, multiple channels. You can go to any one of 10 immigration officers. So multi-channel. First phase is immigration. The second phase is collecting your luggage, which can be in one of multiple carousels. Once you are done with that, the last stage is typically go through a customs officer, and again you may have multiple customs officers. So at each phase, immigration, luggage, customs, you have multiple service providers or channels who can provide the exact same service. So today's discussion will include designing a waiting line system of the most basic type, single channel, single phase. And there are mathematical models for little more complex waiting line systems. But when you are talking about multi-channel, multi-phase, all kinds of different arrival patterns and service patterns, there are not many mathematical tools. You have to resort to tools like simulation to design such waiting lines. Finally, the service time distribution, whether the service distribution is constant or is it negative exponential distribution. There are very few real situations where the service time is constant. Okay, this nice illustration of the different kinds of waiting lines. The most basic that I mentioned, a family dentist office, is a good example of single channel, single phase, assuming there is only one dentist, dental hygienist, and so on. Single channel, multi-phase, this is the same example I gave, a McDonald's dual window drive-through. My example was 3 phases. Multi-channel, single phase. So the example given here is most bank and post office service windows, where you will have multiple clerks who can help you, or tellers, and there is one line, or even if you have multiple lines, that doesn't matter, but your service is completed in one phase, but there are multiple channels. And the most complex one, like I said, is the multi-channel, multi-phase. And the example given here is college registrations, where in the first phase you may have multiple advisors who will advise you what classes to take. Then you may have multiple computers or locations where you can go and register. Then you may have to go to the bursar's office, where there will be multiple clerks who can collect the money from you. So these are all different examples of the waiting line systems, and this gets more complex to design than the single server or the single channel, single phase. So what exactly, as an operations manager, are you looking for in designing, in measuring the performance of a waiting line or a queue? So this gives you a very nice list. The most important are the first couple of them. Average time that each customer spends in the queue, time. The second one is average queue length. Average queue time, waiting time, average length of the waiting line. These are the two most important ones. Obviously, you want to minimize this. And the third and fourth are similar to 1 and 2, except that here the average time each customer spends in the system, that is waiting plus getting the service. This is up to the point where you are called in for the service. You spend the time in the line. This includes that plus the time you spend in the service. This is again similar. It is not only the number of people in the waiting line, but the number of people who are being served. So that is why it is the number of customers in the system. Number 5 is important. 5 and 6 go hand in hand. You, as an operations manager, if I want to minimize 1 through 4, that is the average waiting time and the average queue length, what would I do logically? I will have as many service providers as we want, a lot of service providers. But as business majors, you understand that is not the ideal thing to do. You want to have the highest utilization. Efficiency of the waiting line is important. So the probability that the service facility will be idle should be very low, which means the utilization of the waiting line system or the service providers must be high. Finally, what is the probability of a specific number of customers in the system? What is the probability that there will be 5 people in the system, 4 people in the system, 10 people in the system? That is important to make several decisions. Identifying the number of service providers, identifying the space required for people to wait. All of these can be designed based on number 7. So if you are an operations manager, these are some of the things that you are looking at. So the basic queuing model that we are going to discuss is assuming Poisson distribution arrivals. Again, Poisson distribution arrivals will tell you the rate at which customers are arriving. If the customers are arriving at 10 per hour, that means that you will have on average 1 every 6 minutes, which does not mean 6, 12, 18 are the arrival times. The inter-arrival time is on average 6 minutes. The FIFO discipline, which is first in, first out, is the assumption here. It's a single service phase. The notation used is MM1. The first M stands for the arrival rate being Poisson. The second M stands for the service time to be negative exponential, which is again a different way of putting the Poisson. If some of you are wondering why M, just understand that M stands for memoryless. Okay, it is identical and independent distribution. So it doesn't remember when the last one arrived. We just remember the rate at which customers will arrive. We will just know the rate at which customers will be served. So M and M stands for Poisson and negative exponential, arrival and service. One is obviously that there is a single channel, single server, and we are also assuming that it is number of phases is also single. Population size is unlimited, and the Q discipline is FIFO. The repetitive stuff here. Arrivals are served on a FIFO basis, and every arrival waits to be served regardless of the length of the queue, so there is no balking and reneging. Arrivals are independent of preceding arrivals, but the average number of arrivals does not change over time. That is the whole definition of the IIDs. Arrivals are described by a Poisson probability distribution and come from an infinite population. We discussed this. Service times vary from customer to customer, but are independent of one another again, but their average rate is known. Service times are exponentially distributed. The service rate is faster than the arrival rate. This is the most important thing. Imagine if the service rate is not as fast as the arrival rate. I hope all of you can understand that you will sooner or later have an infinite waiting line. Even when the service rate is faster than the arrival rate, you end up with a waiting line. Why? Because the service rate and the arrival rates are average. So even though you can serve 30 customers an hour and the customers are arriving at 20 per hour, so why do we have a waiting line? Because, like I said, it is a memoryless arrival and a memoryless service, which means even though you can serve 30 per hour, it doesn't mean everybody is going to take 2 minutes. There may be some who may take 1 minute, some who may take 2 minutes, and there may be a small number who may take 5 minutes. And the arrival rate, meaning 20 per hour, does not mean that your arrivals will be 1 every 3 minutes. Sometimes you may get 3 or 4 during a 2-minute period, which will build the waiting line. But on average, you have to have the service rate faster than the arrival rate. Otherwise, you will never clear the waiting line. What happens if the service rate is not as fast as the arrival rate? That is the simple solution is to add a service provider if you have a multi-channel system. the notation in waiting lines, the two most important numbers that you need are lambda and mu, the Greek letters lambda and mu. Lambda is the mean number of arrivals per time period. Lambda is mean number of units served per time period. So mu must be greater than lambda. Then you go back to your characteristics or the performance measures. LS is the average number of units or customers in the system, and WS is the average time a unit spends in the system. Now look at the formula for both of those. All you need are lambda and mu. So you can see the formulae, they're pretty straightforward. And these are the average number of customers in the system and average time a unit spends in the system. Then if you look at L sub q and W sub q, it is the average number of units waiting in the queue, average time a unit spends waiting in the queue. So again, I emphasize LQ and LS in the previous slide. The only difference is in L sub q, you look at the number of customers or units waiting in the queue, whereas in LS, it includes the number of people waiting in the line plus the number of people being served. So if it is a single channel, single phase, the difference between LQ and LS will be only 1, because there is one person being served while the rest are in line. Similarly, W sub q is the average time a unit spends waiting in the queue, and W sub S is the average time a unit spends waiting in the system, which includes the time spent in the queue. And the formula again are a function of lambda and mu. Lambda and mu. Rho is the utilization factor for the system. You don't want this to be 20%, for example. If you have this as 20%, you know that you can reduce the number of servers. You can reduce the number of servers if it is a multi-channel system. But if it's a single channel system like this, you know that if it is a real service provider, a human being, you can make that person do multitasking. Like in a convenience store, the person who is checking out the customers, he or she will be the one looking at the inventory, cleaning up the place, so on, if it's a small convenience store with only one service provider. But you don't want the utilization to be 98% or so. You want the utilization to be at about 80%, because there are going to be peak times when the waiting line is going to get really long, and you don't want the average utilization to be over 80% or 85%. P sub 0 is the probability of 0 units in the system, which is, instead of looking at lambda by mu, which is the efficiency or the utilization of the system, you are looking at 1 minus lambda by mu, which is probability that 0 units are in the system. It's the same thing. And finally, probability of more than k units in the system, where n is the number of units in the system, is given by lambda by mu raised to the power k plus 1. So let's look at a simple example. Lambda is 2 cars arriving per hour. So this is the example of a small auto mechanic shop. 2 cars arriving per hour. Mu is 3 car service per hour. So definitely mu is greater than lambda, which is good. And again, in the exam or in the assignment, if I tell you that the inter-arrival time is 30 minutes, you automatically have to convert that into 2 cars arriving per hour. Basically, make sure that lambda and mu are in Poisson distribution, the rate at which they are arriving, the rate at which they are being serviced. So if I tell you the service time on average is 20 minutes, you should be converting that into mu is equal to 3 cars serviced per hour. The rest of this is pretty straightforward. I won't go through all this. All we are doing here is utilizing the same formulae that we looked at in the previous slides to look at all the operational characteristics. Number of cars in the system on average is given by the simple formula. So there are 2 cars in the system on average. So if you look at L sub q, it should be approximately 1, because this is a single channel, where if there are 2 cars in the system, one is being served, the other one must be in waiting. So look at L sub q, it is 1.33 cars waiting in line. What is the waiting time in the system? About an hour. What is the waiting time in the line? 40 minutes. What is the percentage of time the mechanic is busy? About 2/3 of the time, 66.6%. So 33% of the time there are 0 cars in the system. What is the probability of more than k cars in the system? So you can use this simple formula, and you can see that there is very low probability that there will be more than 3 cars in the system. Of more than 3 cars is only 20%, 19.8%. So all of these will give you an idea of how to design the system. So in this case, if you know that the customers are not willing to wait for more than 30 minutes on average, you know that you have a problem, because they're waiting for 40 minutes on average here. If you know that the customers in this situation are willing to wait for an hour or more, you have no problem. On average, they're waiting for 40 minutes, and they should be very happy with the service. If you know that the customers will balk if they see 3 cars waiting in line to be serviced, you have no problem. You have no more than 1.33 cars on average waiting in line. So these are some of the simple inferences you can come up with looking at these operational characteristics. So what you have seen here is a simple waiting line, and understood the math involved in identifying the time spent by the customer in the system, in the line, the length of the waiting line, and so on, the efficiency of the waiting line. But if you have a more complex waiting line where the arrival or the service rate is not memoryless, meaning it's not Poisson distribution, where it is constant, or if it is not first in first out, or the number of servers is more than 1, it becomes more complex. But there is a mathematical model for many of these models that I just mentioned. But if you have a multi-channel, multi-phase system, then the best solution for you is use simulation to design that system. So this gives you a basic overview of waiting lines from the perspective of an operations manager. Thank you.